All right, hello everybody. I'm going to go through step 3 and step 4 of the Cal TPA. I'm just going to give you a brief explanation. I'm going to look at the directions. I'm going to look at the rubrics. I'm going to look at the templates. I'm just going to explain essentially what it is that the assessor should be looking for according to the rubrics. And hopefully this video will be informative for you as you prepare your Cal TPA in the future. So I'm in the assessment guide over here. And you can see that the directions are very much like the template you just saw. So the directions for step 3 is that you want to respond to the following prompts using the template provided. And you want to cite evidence from steps 1 or 2 for each response. Now, this is what's really important on this regard. This was not what the past TPA is required, because we're on version 2 of the TPA this year. And a lot of people are not doing well in the reflection part, at least step 3, because they missed that. So this important notice box is really important, that you have to make sure that you're citing evidence from your submission from step 1 and 2. That would be the narrative, the lesson plan rationale, and your video clips, as well as your annotations for each response. So that means in every single one of these responses, you should be citing evidence from steps 1 and 2. And I'll show you later why that's important and why that will hurt your score if you don't. So the first question is they really want to know how learning deeply about your students' assets and learning needs, how did that inform or shape your lesson plan for the whole class? So you want to talk about, hey, in step 1, I learned this about my students' assets, this about my learning needs. This is what I was able to do in step 2. And so this is what I kind of learned from that process. How did it inform my lesson plan? How did it shape the lesson plan? The second part is, how did learning deeply about your students' assets and learning needs support student access to engagement with content? So same thing, you're following kind of this sentence stem of, well, in step 1, I learned this about my students' assets and learning needs. In step 2, this is how I implemented what I learned in terms of my planning. And now in step 3, you're basically describing how that supported student access engagement. So really for this question 1, it's about going back to step 1 and 2 and kind of summarizing a little bit about what you did. And then in step 3, explaining, well, how did it go? How did it shape your lesson for the whole class? How did it inform it? And how did it support engagement and access to the content? So you're really kind of talking about now in the aftermath of the lesson, how things went. In question 2, they want to know if your plan was sufficiently flexible to support all students' learning, or did you need to incorporate specific instructional in the moment adaptations for particular students, and then give a rationale. And so, like most teaching, we come up with a plan. We think that that plan will be beneficial, but in the moment, much of what we're going to be learning and what you just learned from either my in-class session, my synchronous session, or if you did it asynchronously, that's this reflecting in action, reflecting in the moment. We might have to make some changes as we go to implement that plan. And so that's really what they want to know from this question. Did you make any changes? Why or why not? Talk specifically about changes you had to make to your plan for your whole class, as well as all 3 of your focus students. And then again, same thing with number 3, how did your instructional approach support learning for the whole class and for each of the 3 focus students to achieve the content-specific learning goals? You just want to talk about 4 paragraphs here. How did your instructional approach support learning for the whole class? And then 3 separate paragraphs for each focus student. Don't forget, in both of these questions, you need to be including evidence from steps 1 and 2 to support your answers. So like in here, you might want to talk about, hey, in step 1, I decided to plan my lesson based on these assets and needs. And then in step 2, I actually realized that things weren't going too well with this. And so yes, I did have to make an in-the-moment adaptation. Same thing here. In step 1, I figured this out about my whole class, so I decided to approach it this way. In step 2, it worked or it didn't work, and here's what I learned from it. And so that's what you really want to be writing in these 3 questions. So I'm going to go to step 4. Well, maybe to keep us on step 3, let's go down to the rubric and just see exactly what the rubric's looking for. Then we can go back up to step 4. So step 3, as you know, the assessors look at 3, and they need to make sure that everything in 3 is there before they move forward. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. So in step 3, you want to make sure in that template that you're connecting the importance of knowing about students' assets and learning needs to student learning. And so again, it's about making that connection to, hey, I recognized that by developing my lesson based on students' assets and learning needs, this is how it impacted student learning. And you're analyzing and describing how knowing that information, and I hate this verbiage here, wish I could get rid of that can. It should have said how knowing this information led to the development of instruction that is supporting, engaging, and challenging to learners or not. It's okay if it didn't work out, but that you have a reason and you're able to reflect on that reason on why it didn't work out for the whole class and for 3 focus students. So I'll be honest, Dr. Sagenda and I have talked a lot about the way level 3 is described by the TPA, and it can be very convoluting and confusing, but we have found that our students are very successful if they focus on the top question. So again, your job is to answer this question: how does the candidate analyze and describe? Meaning you go back and you're looking at evidence from step 1 and 2 and breaking that apart and making those connections to how those first steps impacted the asset and needs-based lesson plan, teaching, and assessment of student learning. And you're explaining how the lesson supported the whole class and the 3 focus students, and or if it didn't support the whole class and the 3 focus students, and what you learned about how you can better support them in the future, which bleeds a little bit into step 4, but that's kind of the purpose of this step, is just to really reflect back on, okay, what did I do in steps 1 and 2, and how did it impact, again, my planning, my teaching, and my assessment, the whole process, as now I'm reflecting and sharing the things that I'm learning. And so that's, in a nutshell, step 3. And so at this point, if you have questions, feel free to set up an office hour with me and we can go through some more. Just explanation and maybe even some hypothetical examples. But again, I have to be wary. I cannot give you any feedback on your current reflection and how you're doing that on your TPA, but I can, go through kind of some examples and different things with you if you need that. Okay, so let's go back up now to step 4. Now that you've done step 3, step 4 is going to ask you to now say, now that you've learned some things and you've kind of analyzed and reflected on the process, what are you going to do with that understanding? And so you're going to respond to these 2 prompts in step 4. You have 2 options for responding. This is what's so great about step 4. You can either do it as a written narrative or you can record yourself. But again, the recording has to be under 5 minutes, and the narrative obviously has its own page limit. But now you're going to be citing evidence from 1, 2, and 3. And so the template will go much like this. Explain what you will do next to advance the learning of whole class of students. So you might want to describe, do I need to reteach any part of the lesson? And again, you're going back to, hey, in step 1, again, this is what I learned. In step 2, this is what I did. In let me go back. In step 1, this is what I collected and understood. Here's what I did in step 2 to try to meet their needs. In step 3, this is what I learned. Now in step 4, I might need to reteach some things, and here's why. The why or why not should be supported by steps 1, 2, and 3. Based on the whole class of students, based on what the whole class of students learned about the content you were teaching, what will you teach next? And so again, it's that I'm going to teach this next because citing evidence from step 1, 2, and 3. And that will make that much stronger and get you the 3 or higher that you're looking for. So if you were to develop and teach this lesson again, what would you do the same or differently to improve deep learning of content and academic language for the whole class of students, and why? So there's a lot of pieces here. Again, deep learning, how would you get them to go cognitively farther, the next step? Maybe you were having them analyze. Do they need to go further in that analysis? Do they need to learn more content to get deeper into their analysis? You need to also talk about how you're going to develop their academic language, and you need to do it for the whole class, and you need to provide a reason why. And that why, again, comes from steps 1, 2, and 3, or at least supported by steps 1, 2, and 3. So again, no more than 3 pages on the application section, no more than 5 minutes of video explanation on the application section. So again, I'm going to go back down to the rubric, and I didn't do this a second ago, but I want to make sure I'm clear. Step 3 rubric. Again, if you are not citing evidence from steps 1 or 2, you notice where you start to fall. And this is, honestly, as a remediator, this is what I'm seeing a lot, is that I see students falling in steps or getting a 1 on step 3 because they didn't cite evidence from steps 1 and 2. So make sure you do that. That's so important. And then finally, in step 4, you are going to be doing this. So candidate needs to apply what they've learned, i.e. from step 3, to describe future instruction for students that is designed to strengthen and extend deep content learning. So again, that's the first piece. You need to talk about how it will go a little bit farther, and academic language development. I think students miss that piece too. And so they might talk about, the next step I'm going to do is X, Y, and Z, but they also forget to explain how that will develop their academic language, specifically thinking of maybe your English language learners and your whole class that need to further that development. So you need to make sure you include both pieces. And then again, you're providing those next steps for instruction by citing evidence of student learning assessed during the lesson. So you want to talk about what students learned in step 2 and what you've learned in step 3, and all of that needs to be there. If not, you're falling down in this category. You're not citing evidence from steps 1, 2, or 3. And it says and or 3, so it's very important that you're including most of those, steps 1, 2. And so, excuse me, I'm stumbling over my words. It's just important that you include evidence from 1, 2, and or 3, meaning whatever makes sense in this case. So you could include step 1 and 3, or steps 1 or 2 or 3. So again, it's just important that you're citing evidence in order to support the reasons why you're making these next steps for instruction. So in a nutshell, that is steps 3 and 4. Again, you're reflecting on what you've learned from steps 1 and 2. And in step 4, you're taking what you've learned in step 3 and talking about what you're going to do next.